Hay thought a fine would break him, but when they tried to punish the wrong man, he turned the tables, owning the one thing they couldn't live without. I stood at my newly installed toll booth, watching 37 angry neighbors lined up in their cars, each forced to pay me $5 just to get to their own homes. The morning sun glinted off the fresh, private road. Toll required sign as Marcus Thompson, the HOA president, stepped out of his BMW, his face purple with rage. "You can't do this," he screamed, waving a crumpled HOA violation notice in the air. "This is illegal. This is insane." But I just smiled and pointed to the perfectly legal deed in my hand, the deed that made me the sole owner of Maple Grove Lane, the only road leading into our exclusive neighborhood. 6 months ago, Marcus had fined me $300 for parking my grandfather's vintage John Deere tractor in my own driveway, claiming it violated the aesthetic standards of our community. He called it an eyesore, a property value destroyer, a blight on our pristine neighborhood. He threatened to place a lien on my house if I didn't comply within 72 hours. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was not researching who he was messing with before he started this war. Marcus had no idea that I was a real estate attorney with 20 years of experience in property law, or that I had been quietly studying every single HOA document, every city ordinance, and every property deed in our neighborhood for months. He definitely didn't know that I had discovered something absolutely devastating about our community's infrastructure, something that would give me the ultimate revenge. As I collected another $5 toll from Mrs. Henderson's confused husband, I couldn't help but chuckle at the beautiful irony. Marcus thought he could bully me into submission with his petty power games and ridiculous fines. Instead, he had awakened a sleeping giant who now controlled the very ground his house sat on. The best part? This was just the beginning of his nightmare. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they were untouchable? Let me know in the comments, because this story is about to get wild. Marcus Thompson had ruled our Maple Grove neighborhood, HOA, like a medieval king for 8 long years, and his reign of terror had only gotten worse with time. Standing at 6'2" with perfectly styled silver hair and wearing his signature navy blazer, Marcus carried himself like he owned every blade of grass in our community. And in his mind, he absolutely did. His cold gray eyes would scan the neighborhood each morning during his inspection walks, searching for any violation he could exploit to assert his dominance over the residents. Marcus had transformed what should have been a simple homeowners association into his personal kingdom, complete with a board of yes-men who rubber-stamped his every decision. He had installed his best friend David Chun as vice president, his golf buddy Robert Martinez as treasurer, and his neighbor Jim Wilson as secretary. All of them too intimidated or too comfortable with their positions to ever challenge his authority. The man had an obsession with control that bordered on pathological, and he wielded the HOA rules like a weapon against anyone who dared to question his judgment. His filing cabinets were stuffed with violation notices, legal threats, and documentation of every minor infraction he could possibly imagine. Dead flowers in a garden bed, $50 fine. Garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup, $75 fine. Christmas decorations still up on January 2nd, $100 fine, plus a formal warning. Marcus had even fined the elderly Mr. Patterson for having a garden gnome that was inconsistent with the community's upscale image, despite the fact that the poor man had been dealing with his wife's recent death and hadn't been keeping up with the increasingly ridiculous HOA newsletter updates. The psychological warfare Marcus employed was methodical and cruel. He would drive slowly past houses he suspected of violations, taking photos with his expensive camera and making detailed notes in his leather-bound violation journal. He had recruited a network of neighborhood spies who would report on their neighbors' activities, rewarding them with reduced HOA fees or overlooking their own minor violations. Marcus would schedule surprise compliance inspections, where he would walk through people's yards with a measuring tape, checking fence heights, mailbox positions, and paint color accuracy against the approved HOA palette. His meetings were theatrical performances where he would dramatically read violation letters aloud, publicly shaming residents in front of their neighbors while wearing a smug expression of moral superiority. But Marcus's cruelest tactic was his use of legal intimidation against residents who couldn't afford to fight back. He would threaten liens, foreclosure proceedings, and expensive legal battles against single mothers, elderly residents, and young families who were already struggling financially. His favorite phrase was "compliance is not optional," which he would deliver with a cold smile that never reached his calculating eyes. The man genuinely believed that his position as HOA president made him some kind of suburban dictator, and he had successfully bullied dozens of families into submission over the years. Marcus's house, of course, was the crown jewel of the neighborhood, a massive colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn, professional landscaping, and not a single blade of grass out of place. He made sure everyone knew that his property was the standard by which all others should be measured, often pointing out during meetings how his commitment to excellence was what made Maple Grove such a desirable place to live. The irony was that Marcus's own success had made him completely blind to the fact that not everyone had the time, money, or energy to maintain their property to his impossible standards, and his lack of empathy had created a community built on fear rather than neighborly cooperation. The violation notice appeared on my door on a Tuesday morning like a declaration of war, written on official HOA letterhead with Marcus's aggressive signature scrawled across the bottom in thick black ink. Immediate compliance required. The heading screamed in bold red letters, followed by a detailed description of how my grandfather's 1952 John Deere tractor was supposedly destroying the aesthetic integrity and property values of our entire neighborhood. According to Marcus's 3-page violation report, my tractor constituted a commercial vehicle, an agricultural eyesore, and a non-conforming recreational vehicle that violated sections 4.2, 7.8, and 12.5 of our HOA covenant. The fine was set at $300, with an additional $50 per day until the offending vehicle was removed from my property permanently. Marcus had even included professionally taken photographs of my tractor from multiple angles, along with a property appraisal report claiming that my tractor's presence was reducing neighborhood property values by an estimated $15,000 per home. The tractor in question wasn't some rusted-out piece of farm equipment. It was a beautifully restored vintage machine that my grandfather had left me in his will, complete with original paint, functioning hydraulics, and historical significance as one of the first tractors manufactured after World War II. I had spent countless weekends working on that tractor with my grandfather, learning about engines, hydraulics, and the value of hard work, and it represented one of my most treasured family memories. The tractor was parked in my own driveway, on my own property, and caused absolutely no harm to anyone in the neighborhood. Several neighbors had even complimented me on the restoration work and asked about its history. But Marcus had decided that my tractor didn't fit his vision of suburban perfection, and he was determined to force me to get rid of it regardless of its sentimental value or my property rights. The violation notice included a timeline that was clearly designed to maximize pressure and minimize my options for response. I had 72 hours to remove the tractor completely, followed by a mandatory hearing where Marcus and his board would determine appropriate ongoing compliance measures to prevent future violations. If I failed to comply within the initial 72-hour period, the daily fines would begin immediately, and Marcus threatened to place a lien on my house within 30 days. The notice also warned that continued non-compliance may result in foreclosure proceedings, and that I would be responsible for all legal fees and court costs associated with enforcement actions. Marcus had clearly researched the most aggressive legal language possible, and his violation notice read more like a hostile takeover attempt than a reasonable request for neighborhood compliance. But the most infuriating part of the entire situation was Marcus's complete disregard for the fact that several other residents had vehicles and equipment that were far more questionable than my restored tractor. Jim Wilson, the HOA secretary, had a massive RV parked behind his house that was visible from the street and definitely violated the same recreational vehicle rules Marcus was using against me. David Chun, the vice president, had been running an unlicensed home-based business repairing motorcycles in his garage, complete with customers coming and going at all hours and motorcycle parts scattered across his driveway. Robert Martinez, the treasurer, had installed an above-ground swimming pool without proper permits and had been dumping pool chemicals directly into the storm drains for months. Yet none of these board members had received violation notices, fines, or threats of legal action. Marcus was clearly using selective enforcement to target me specifically while protecting his cronies from the same rules he was weaponizing against me. The selective enforcement was so blatant that it bordered on harassment, and I realized that Marcus had chosen me as his next victim not because of any legitimate HOA concern, but because he wanted to flex his authority and demonstrate his power to the rest of the neighborhood. What Marcus didn't know about me could fill several law books, and his ignorance was about to become his greatest weakness in this escalating battle. While he saw me as just another suburban homeowner who would cave under pressure like all his previous victims, I was actually a licensed real estate attorney with 2 decades of experience in property law, municipal regulations, and homeowners association disputes. My law degree from Stanford and my years of practice had given me an intimate understanding of exactly how HOA enforcement worked, what constituted legal versus illegal harassment, and most importantly, how to find the weaknesses in seemingly bulletproof legal documents. I had handled dozens of HOA cases over the years, representing both associations and individual homeowners, which meant I understood the game from both sides and knew exactly what tactics Marcus was likely to use before he even thought of them himself. My home office contained an extensive legal library, multiple subscription databases for property research, and professional relationships with title companies, municipal clerks, and county assessors who could provide information that most people would never think to request. While Marcus was busy taking photographs of my tractor and drafting his threatening violation notice, I was quietly beginning the most thorough investigation of our neighborhood's legal foundation that had probably ever been conducted. I started with the basics, pulling every property deed, HOA covenant, municipal and corporation document, and zoning variants that had been filed for our neighborhood since its development in 1987. What I discovered in those dusty municipal files was absolutely fascinating and potentially devastating for Marcus's little kingdom. The original developer had made several unusual agreements with the city regarding infrastructure maintenance, utility easements, and road ownership that had never been properly documented in the individual property deeds. The HOA covenants contained several ambiguous clauses about enforcement procedures, board authority, and violation appeals that Marcus had been either ignoring or deliberately misinterpreting for years. Most importantly, I found discrepancies between the original subdivision plat, the current property descriptions, and the actual municipal records that suggested some very interesting questions about who actually owned certain pieces of our neighborhood infrastructure. My investigation revealed that Marcus had been operating under several legally questionable assumptions about his authority, and his pattern of selective enforcement could potentially constitute harassment, discrimination, and abuse of his board position. I spent weeks documenting every violation notice Marcus had issued over the past 5 years, cross-referencing them with the actual HOA covenants, and identifying dozens of cases where he had either exceeded his authority or applied rules inconsistently. The more I researched, the more I realized that Marcus had created a vulnerability in his own armor. His aggressive, authoritarian approach had generated a paper trail of potentially illegal actions that could be used against him if the situation escalated to actual legal proceedings. But the most interesting discovery came when I started researching the ownership history of Maple Grove Lane itself, the main road that provided the only access to our entire neighborhood. Municipal records showed that the road had been built by the original developer as a private drive, with ownership and maintenance responsibilities that were supposed to transfer to the city after completion of the subdivision. However, due to a series of bureaucratic oversights, clerical errors, and failed municipal inspections, the transfer had never actually been completed, which meant that Maple Grove Lane was still technically private property rather than a public road maintained by the city. Even more fascinating was the discovery that the current legal owner of Maple Grove Lane was listed as Maple Grove Development Corporation, a company that had been dissolved in 1994 without properly transferring its assets to any successor entity. This created what property lawyers call a title defect, A situation where valuable real estate exists without a clear, legally recognized owner, making it potentially available for acquisition through adverse possession, quiet title action, or direct purchase from the bankruptcy estate of the dissolved corporation. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community center on a humid Thursday evening, with Marcus presiding over his usual audience of intimidated homeowners who attended more out of fear than genuine interest in community governance. I had requested to be added to the agenda to discuss my recent violation notice, which Marcus had smugly approved, clearly expecting to make an example of me in front of the entire neighborhood. He had even invited several additional residents to witness what he assumed would be my public capitulation and removal of the tractor, planning to use my submission as a warning to anyone else who might consider challenging his authority. Marcus opened the meeting with his typical pompous ceremony, reading through routine business items while wearing his most authoritarian expression and occasionally glancing in my direction with barely concealed satisfaction. When he finally called my name to address the tractor violation, he stood up dramatically and launched into a prepared speech about maintaining community standards and the importance of compliance with our shared covenant. He held up the violation notice like it was a legal verdict, explaining to the assembled residents how my tractor represented everything that was wrong with homeowners who thought they were above the rules that everyone else had to follow. Marcus's confidence was absolutely radiant as he described the $300 fine, the daily penalties, and the potential lien on my property, clearly believing that his public shaming would force me to comply immediately and demonstrate his power to everyone present. But when I stood up to respond, I didn't apologize, grovel, or promise to remove my tractor. Instead, I calmly pulled out a thick folder of documents and began my own presentation that would shatter Marcus's world in front of his own audience. I started by distributing copies of the original HOA covenant to every person in the room, pointing out specific sections that Marcus had been either ignoring or deliberately misinterpreting in his enforcement actions. I showed documented evidence of his selective enforcement, including photographs and violation records that proved he had been applying different standards to different residents based on his personal relationships rather than consistent rule application. The room grew increasingly uncomfortable as I presented case after case of Marcus's discriminatory enforcement, including his complete failure to address violations by his own board members while aggressively pursuing minor infractions by residents who had questioned his authority. Then I dropped the first bombshell, a detailed legal analysis showing that Marcus's violation notice against my tractor was based on a fundamental misinterpretation of the HOA covenant language, and that according to the actual legal text, my tractor was completely compliant with all legitimate restrictions. I explained that Marcus had invented new categories of violations that didn't exist in our governing documents, and that his threatened lien would be legally invalid because he had failed to follow proper due process procedures required by state law. The residents began murmuring among themselves as they realized that Marcus's seemingly bulletproof authority was actually built on a foundation of legal ignorance and deliberate deception. But the real devastation came when I revealed the results of my research into our neighborhood's infrastructure ownership, explaining that Maple Grove Lane was not actually a public road maintained by the city, but rather private property that had been abandoned by its original owner and was potentially available for acquisition. I watched Marcus's face drain of color as I described how the dissolved development corporation had never properly transferred ownership of our only access road, creating a title defect that made the road legally ownerless and subject to acquisition through various legal mechanisms. The room fell completely silent as I explained that I had already initiated the process to acquire ownership of Maple Grove Lane through a quiet title action, and that if successful, I would become the sole owner of the road that every single resident, including Marcus, needed to access their own homes. Marcus tried to interrupt, claiming that my presentation was irrelevant to the tractor violation and that I was trying to distract from my noncompliance. But his voice cracked with panic as he realized that his position of power was crumbling in real time. 6 weeks after that devastating HOA meeting, I stood in the county clerk's office holding the most beautiful document I had ever seen, a clear title deed that made me the sole legal owner of Maple Grove Lane, including the road surface. underlying land, and all associated easements for our entire neighborhood's only access route. The quiet title action had proceeded exactly as I had predicted, with no legitimate claimants emerging to contest my acquisition of the abandoned property, and the judge had been impressed by the thoroughness of my legal research and documentation. Marcus had attempted to hire his own attorney to oppose my claim, but his lawyer had quickly realized that the title defect was real and that Marcus had no legal standing to prevent my acquisition of property that had never belonged to the HOA or any individual resident. The cost of acquiring the road had been surprisingly reasonable, just $12,000 in legal fees, court costs, and back taxes, which was a small price to pay for the ultimate revenge against Marcus's years of tyrannical behavior. My first act as the new owner of Maple Grove Lane was to install professional private road signs at both ends of the street, along with clearly posted notices that use of this private road requires permission from owner and unauthorized vehicles subject to towing. I had researched the legal requirements for private road tolls extensively, ensuring that my signage met all municipal and state requirements for notification, that my toll rates were reasonable and non-discriminatory, and that I provided alternative access information for emergency vehicles and essential services. The toll booth itself was a thing of beauty, a small but sturdy structure positioned at the entrance to Maple Grove Lane, complete with a mechanical arm barrier, electronic payment system, and security cameras to document all transactions. I had hired a professional contractor to install the booth according to all applicable building codes, and I had obtained the necessary business licenses and permits to operate a private toll road legally. The toll rate was set at $5 per vehicle per passage, which was reasonable compared to other private roads in our area, and I offered monthly unlimited passes for residents at $50 per household. Still a bargain compared to the violation fines Marcus had been imposing on people for trivial infractions. The first morning the toll booth was operational was absolutely magical, as I watched through my security cameras while confused residents discovered that their previously free access to their own neighborhood now required payment to the very person Marcus had tried to bully into submission. Marcus himself was the third car in line, and his face was priceless as he realized that his attempt to fine me $300 for parking my tractor had resulted in him having to pay me $5 every single time he wanted to go home. The psychological impact of the toll booth went far beyond the financial cost. It was a daily reminder to every resident that Marcus's abuse of power had consequences and that his victims weren't always going to remain helpless against his tyranny. Within the first week, I had collected over $800 in toll fees from residents who had no choice but to pay if they wanted to access their own homes, and the money kept rolling in as people realized that I wasn't bluffing about owning their only road. The beautiful irony was that Marcus's own violation notice had specifically complained about property values, claiming that my tractor was reducing the worth of neighborhood homes. But now every single house in Maple Grove was subject to a permanent toll access fee that actually did affect property values in a measurable way. Marcus tried calling the police, the city council, the county commissioner, and even the state attorney general, but every authority confirmed that my ownership of the road was completely legal and that my toll charges were within my rights as a private property owner. His attempts to organize a neighborhood boycott failed miserably when residents realized that they had no alternative access to their homes, and his threats of legal action rang hollow when his own attorney advised him that I had followed all applicable laws and regulations in acquiring and operating my private toll road. The weeks following my toll booth installation brought out the absolute worst in Marcus Thompson, as his carefully constructed facade of suburban respectability crumbled under the pressure of daily humiliation and financial loss. His first desperate strategy was to call an emergency HOA meeting, demanding that the board take immediate legal action to reclaim our community road and stop what he dramatically called economic terrorism against innocent homeowners. Standing before a much smaller audience than usual, many residents had stopped attending HOA meetings after witnessing his public demolition. Marcus ranted for nearly an hour about property rights, community standards, and his determination to restore normal access to our neighborhood. He waved around copies of old HOA documents that he claimed proved the association had some kind of ownership interest in Maple Grove Lane, despite the fact that his own attorney had already advised him that no such ownership existed and that my title to the road was legally unassailable. His voice cracked with desperation as he proposed special assessments, emergency legal funds, and even the possibility of incorporating the neighborhood as a municipality to gain government authority over road access. But his board members, David Chun, Robert Martinez, and Jim Wilson, were noticeably less enthusiastic about following Marcus down this particular rabbit hole, especially after I had made it clear that their own violations would receive much more scrutiny if they chose to escalate the conflict further. Marcus's second approach was to launch a harassment campaign designed to make my life miserable and force me to sell the road back to the neighborhood at a loss. He began filing frivolous complaints with every municipal department he could think of, claiming that my toll booth violated zoning regulations, that my business license was improperly obtained, and that my security cameras were invading residents' privacy. He submitted formal complaints to the state attorney general's office alleging that my toll charges constituted illegal extortion, to the county health department claiming that my toll booth was a public health hazard, and to the Environmental Protection Agency arguing that my road ownership somehow violated wetland protection regulations. Each complaint required me to respond with documentation and legal filings, which Marcus hoped would exhaust my patience and financial resources. But his strategy backfired when government officials began recognizing his name as a serial complainant and started dismissing his reports without investigation. Marcus also attempted to organize a community-wide lawsuit against me, claiming that my road ownership constituted a taking of community property that required compensation to all affected residents. He spent thousands of dollars of his own money hiring a different attorney who was willing to file the lawsuit despite its obvious weaknesses, and he tried to recruit other residents to join as co-plaintiffs in what he portrayed as a righteous battle for neighborhood freedom. But most residents were reluctant to spend their own money on legal fees for a lawsuit that even Marcus's attorney admitted had little chance of success, and several homeowners pointed out that they were more angry at Marcus for creating the situation than at me for legally acquiring abandoned property. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed with prejudice when the judge ruled that Marcus and his co-plaintiffs had no legal standing to challenge my ownership of property that had never belonged to them in the first place. Perhaps most pathetically, Marcus began attempting to sabotage my toll booth operation through petty vandalism and harassment, apparently believing that he could force me to abandon the road if he made operating it sufficiently difficult. He would drive past the toll booth multiple times per day, taking photographs and measurements that he claimed were for documentation purposes, but were obviously intended to intimidate me. He organized his remaining loyal supporters to form rolling blockades, where they would pay their tolls as slowly as possible, counting out $5 in pennies or asking endless questions about receipt procedures to create traffic backups. Marcus even went so far as to scatter nails and debris on the road surface, hoping to create maintenance problems that would force me to spend money on repairs. But his sabotage efforts were captured on my security cameras and provided excellent evidence for the restraining order I eventually obtained against him. The toll booth situation had an unexpected effect on our neighborhood that Marcus never anticipated. It finally gave residents the courage to speak openly about years of accumulated resentment toward his authoritarian leadership and abusive enforcement tactics. What started as grumbling about $5 toll fees quickly evolved into broader conversations about Marcus's pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and financial mismanagement of HOA funds over his 8-year reign as president. Residents began sharing stories that had been whispered privately for years, comparing notes about ridiculous violation notices, discriminatory fines, and Marcus's use of legal intimidation against families who couldn't afford to fight back. The elderly Mr. Patterson, who had been fined for his garden gnome while grieving his wife's death, became particularly vocal about Marcus's lack of compassion and his transformation of what should have been a supportive community into a climate of fear and compliance. Mrs. Henderson's husband started an informal neighborhood survey documenting every violation notice Marcus had issued over the past 3 years, revealing a clear pattern of targeting residents who had questioned his authority while completely ignoring similar violations by his board member cronies. The survey results were damning. Marcus had issued over 200 violation notices during his tenure, with fines totaling more than $30,000, while board members had received exactly 0 violations despite numerous documented infractions of the same rules. Young families who had been struggling to maintain their properties according to Marcus's impossible standards began organizing informal support groups, sharing resources and labor to help each other avoid the violation notices that had been causing financial stress for years. The neighborhood WhatsApp group, which had previously been dominated by Marcus's announcements and violation warnings, became a forum for residents to share their frustrations and discuss potential solutions to the HOA's toxic leadership culture. Several residents began researching the legal requirements for removing board members, recalling HOA officers, and potentially dissolving the association entirely if necessary to escape Marcus's tyrannical control. The mood shift was so dramatic that Marcus's weekly inspection walks became community events, with residents coming out of their houses to openly photograph his harassment behavior and document his selective enforcement for potential legal action. His former network of neighborhood spies began refusing to participate in his surveillance activities, and several admitted to neighbors that they had been reporting violations only because Marcus had threatened them with retaliation if they didn't cooperate with his information-gathering efforts. The toll booth became a symbol of resistance that inspired residents to stand up to Marcus in ways they had never dared before, with people openly displaying prohibited garden decorations, parking recreational vehicles in clear view, and ignoring his increasingly frantic violation notices. The psychological dynamic of the neighborhood had completely reversed. Instead of fearing Marcus's authority, residents were now emboldened by the clear demonstration that his power could be challenged successfully and that bullies could face consequences for their actions. Board members David Chun, Robert Martinez, and Jim Wilson found themselves increasingly isolated as residents began demanding explanations for their years of enabling Marcus's abusive behavior and their failure to provide any oversight of his discriminatory enforcement actions. The weekly HOA meetings, which had previously been sparsely attended affairs where Marcus lectured intimidated residents, became packed confrontational sessions where angry homeowners demanded accountability, transparency, and immediate changes to the association's leadership structure. Marcus's attempts to maintain control through parliamentary procedure and meeting rules were shouted down by residents who were no longer willing to be silenced by his authoritarian tactics, and his board members began missing meetings rather than face the increasingly hostile questions about their complicity in years of harassment and financial mismanagement. The toll booth situation was just the beginning of Marcus's problems, as my legal training had taught me that bullies like him rarely limit their misconduct to a single area, and a thorough investigation of his HOA activities revealed a treasure trove of potentially illegal behavior that went far beyond selective enforcement of neighborhood violations. I began systematically examining the association's financial records, board meeting minutes, and correspondence files, using my legal access rights as a neighborhood resident to request documents that Marcus had been keeping hidden from general membership review. What I discovered was even worse than I had anticipated. 8 years of financial irregularities, unauthorized expenditures, and self-dealing that suggested Marcus had been treating the HOA treasury as his personal piggy bank while imposing harsh fines on residents for minor infractions. The financial records showed numerous payments to Marcus's own business associates for community improvement projects that had never been approved by the membership, including landscaping work performed by his brother-in-law's company at rates significantly above market value and security services provided by his golf buddy's firm without competitive bidding. Marcus had been authorizing expenditures of HOA funds for legal services related to his personal vendettas against specific residents, including the attorney fees for pursuing violation cases that had nothing to do with legitimate community interests and everything to do with his desire to punish homeowners who had challenged his authority. The most egregious discovery was evidence that Marcus had been using HOA funds to pay for his own property improvements, disguising personal landscaping and maintenance work as community demonstration projects, that were supposedly showing other residents how to maintain their properties properly. His financial mismanagement included unauthorized loans to board members, payments for country club memberships that were supposedly for community networking, and reimbursements for personal travel expenses that Marcus claimed were related to HOA education and training seminars. The total amount of questionable expenditures exceeded $50,000 over his tenure as president, and much of the spending had been approved through emergency board resolutions that bypassed the normal membership approval process required by the HOA's governing documents. Armed with this evidence, I filed formal complaints with the State Attorney General's office alleging embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty, with the county prosecutor requesting investigation of potential criminal charges, and with the IRS questioning the association's tax-exempt status given the personal benefits Marcus had been extracting from organizational funds. The legal pressure intensified when several other residents, emboldened by my example, filed their own complaints with various regulatory agencies and began demanding forensic audits of all HOA financial activities during Marcus's presidency. Marcus's attempts to cover up his financial misconduct only made the situation worse, as he began shredding documents, deleting email accounts, and pressuring board members to provide false testimony about expenditure approvals they had never actually given. His panicked response to the investigations created additional evidence of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation, turning what might have been civil financial disputes into potential criminal charges that could result in jail time rather than just monetary penalties. The IRS audit was particularly devastating, as investigators discovered that Marcus had been claiming personal tax deductions for expenses that he had also been reimbursing from HOA funds, constituting double-dipping that violated both tax regulations and his fiduciary duties to the association membership. His legal bills began mounting exponentially as he was forced to hire separate attorneys for the criminal investigation, the civil lawsuits, the IRS audit, and the state regulatory proceedings, with each lawyer requiring substantial retainers that quickly exhausted his personal savings and forced him to mortgage his house to pay for legal defense costs. The financial pressure was so severe that Marcus was forced to take a second mortgage on his pristine colonial home, the same property he had held up as the neighborhood standard during his years of harassment, and his wife began pressuring him to resign from the HOA board and settle the various legal disputes before they lost their house entirely. The mounting legal and financial pressure surrounding Marcus created a domino effect that systematically destroyed the entire HOA power structure he had spent 8 years building, as his board member cronies began abandoning him to protect their own interests and reputations. David Chun, the vice president who had rubber-stamped Marcus's decisions for years, was the first to crack under pressure when investigators began examining his unlicensed motorcycle repair business and questioning whether HOA funds had been used to purchase tools and equipment for his personal commercial activities. Faced with potential criminal charges for his own misconduct, David hired his own attorney and began cooperating with authorities by providing detailed information about Marcus's financial irregularities and decision-making processes that violated the association's governing documents. His testimony revealed that Marcus had been making unilateral decisions about fines, expenditures, and enforcement actions without proper board approval, and that board meetings had become rubber stamp sessions where Marcus would present decisions he had already made and demand immediate approval without discussion or debate. Robert Martinez, the treasurer who should have been overseeing HOA finances, found himself in an impossible position when auditors discovered that he had been signing blank checks and approving expenditures without reviewing supporting documentation, essentially allowing Marcus to spend association funds without any meaningful oversight or accountability. His attorney advised him that his negligent performance of fiduciary duties could result in personal liability for the association's financial losses, and he quickly resigned from the board while publicly distancing himself from Marcus's unauthorized spending and discriminatory enforcement practices. Robert's resignation letter, which he distributed to all neighborhood residents, contained explosive allegations about Marcus's manipulation of board processes and his use of intimidation tactics to prevent board members from questioning his decisions or demanding proper documentation for expenditures. Jim Wilson, the secretary who had been responsible for maintaining accurate records of board meetings and decisions, became a key witness in the various investigations when it was discovered that the official meeting minutes he had been filing bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred during board sessions. Under pressure from investigators and facing potential perjury charges for filing false official documents, Jim admitted that Marcus had been editing meeting minutes after the fact to make unauthorized decisions appear as if they had been properly approved by the full board through legitimate voting processes. His cooperation with authorities provided crucial evidence about Marcus's pattern of document manipulation and his systematic violation of the association's governance procedures over multiple years. The board collapse accelerated when residents began filing individual lawsuits against Marcus and the remaining board members, claiming damages for discriminatory enforcement, harassment, and breach of fiduciary duty that had reduced their property values and caused emotional distress. The legal liability exposure became so severe that the association's insurance company began threatening to cancel coverage unless Marcus was removed from his position immediately, and several board members received personal legal notices warning them that they could be held individually responsible for damages if they continued to enable Marcus's misconduct. With his board support completely evaporated and facing multiple criminal and civil investigations, Marcus found himself completely isolated and unable to conduct any legitimate HOA business, as residents refused to recognize his authority and no other community members were willing to serve on the board under his leadership. The association effectively ceased functioning as a governing body, with violations going unenforced, meetings being boycotted by residents, and routine maintenance being handled through informal neighborhood cooperation rather than through official HOA channels. The power vacuum created by the board's collapse actually improved the neighborhood significantly, as residents began working together voluntarily to address community issues without the fear, harassment, and financial pressure that had characterized Marcus's reign of terror. Property values began recovering as the oppressive atmosphere lifted and families no longer feared arbitrary fines and legal threats for minor aesthetic disagreements with an authoritarian board president. The multiple investigations into Marcus's conduct reached their inevitable conclusion when the county prosecutor's office filed formal criminal charges, including embezzlement, fraud, obstruction of justice, and breach of fiduciary duty based on the overwhelming evidence of his systematic theft and misuse of HOA funds over his 8-year presidency. The indictment detailed 17 specific counts of financial misconduct, ranging from the unauthorized diversion of association funds for personal use to the falsification of official documents to cover up his illegal expenditures and self-dealing arrangements with family members and business associates. The prosecution's case was ironclad, supported by bank records, canceled checks, altered meeting minutes, and testimony from multiple witnesses, including his former board members who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges related to their own negligent oversight of his criminal activities. The most damaging evidence came from digital forensics experts who had recovered deleted emails and financial record from Marcus's personal computer, revealing detailed communications about his schemes to extract money from the HOA treasury and his awareness that his actions violated both the association's governing documents and state laws regarding nonprofit organization management. The criminal charges were accompanied by civil asset forfeiture proceedings seeking to recover the stolen HOA funds, which meant that Marcus's house, bank accounts, and other personal property were frozen pending resolution of the criminal case and calculation of the full extent of his financial crimes against the association membership. His pristine colonial home, which he had held up as the neighborhood standard during his years of harassment, was now marked with official notices of pending forfeiture and faced potential seizure by law enforcement to compensate victims of his embezzlement scheme. The media attention surrounding Marcus's arrest was extensive, with local news outlets reporting on the HOA tyrant who had terrorized his neighbors for years before being exposed as a common thief who had been stealing from the very community he claimed to be protecting through his aggressive enforcement of neighborhood standards. The irony was not lost on reporters or residents that Marcus's obsession with maintaining property values and community aesthetics had been motivated primarily by his desire to create a successful neighborhood that would generate higher HOA fees for him to steal rather than any genuine concern for community welfare. His mugshot appeared in newspapers and online news sites alongside stories about his pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and financial crimes, permanently destroying his reputation and making him a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority in residential communities. Marcus's legal defense strategy was hampered by his lack of financial resources, as his personal assets were frozen and his mounting legal bills from multiple civil and criminal cases had already forced him to mortgage his house and deplete his savings accounts. His court-appointed attorney advised him that the evidence was overwhelming and that his best option was to negotiate a plea agreement that would involve restitution payments, community service, and a reduced jail sentence in exchange for admitting guilt and cooperating with efforts to recover the stolen funds. The plea negotiations were complicated by Marcus's refusal to accept responsibility for his actions, as he continued to maintain that his expenditures had been legitimate association business and that the various investigations were part of a conspiracy by disgruntled residents who wanted to avoid paying their fair share of community maintenance costs. His arrogant attitude during court proceedings alienated the judge and prosecutors, who noted that Marcus showed no remorse for his crimes and seemed to believe that his position as HOA president had given him unlimited authority to spend other people's money without accountability or oversight. The criminal trial became a public spectacle as dozens of neighborhood residents attended hearings to witness Marcus's final downfall, and several victims gave impact statements describing how his years of harassment and financial misconduct had affected their families, their finances, and their sense of security in their own homes. The final resolution of Marcus Thompson's legal troubles was a masterpiece of poetic justice that stripped him of everything he had accumulated during his years of neighborhood tyranny and left him facing the same kind of financial devastation he had threatened to impose on so many innocent residents through his abusive enforcement tactics. The criminal court sentenced him to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation, during which time he would be prohibited from serving in any leadership position with any homeowners association or nonprofit organization, effectively ending his career as a suburban dictator permanently. The restitution order required him to repay $67,000 in stolen HOA funds plus interest and penalties, a sum that exceeded his available assets and guaranteed that he would be making monthly payments to his former victims for years to come. His beautiful colonial home, the crown jewel property he had used as the standard for neighborhood compliance, was sold at a court-ordered auction to satisfy the restitution judgment, with the proceeds going directly to the HOA treasury to compensate residents for his years of embezzlement and financial mismanagement. The house sold for significantly less than its peak value, partly because potential buyers were aware of its notorious history, and partly because Marcus had been forced to defer maintenance and improvements while spending his money on legal defense costs rather than property upkeep. The new owners were a young family with children who immediately installed a playground set, painted the house bright yellow, and planted wildflower gardens that would have given Marcus heart palpitations during his obsessive enforcement years, creating a delightful symbol of the neighborhood's liberation from his aesthetic tyranny. Marcus's wife, who had been gradually distancing herself from his legal troubles throughout the investigation, filed for divorce and moved out of state to live with relatives, taking their joint savings and leaving Marcus to face his criminal sentence and financial obligations alone. His former board member cronies publicly denounced him and claimed they had been unaware of his criminal activities, despite evidence showing their negligent oversight had enabled his misconduct for years, and none of them offered any support or assistance during his legal battles. The professional consequences extended beyond his criminal sentence, as Marcus lost his job with a local insurance company when his employer decided that his conviction for embezzlement and fraud made him unsuitable for a position requiring financial responsibility and trustworthiness. His professional licenses were revoked, his business relationships were terminated, and his reputation in the community was permanently destroyed, making it unlikely that he would ever again achieve the kind of social status and authority he had abused so extensively during his HOA presidency. The neighborhood itself underwent a remarkable transformation following Marcus's removal, as residents worked together to establish a new HOA structure with term limits, financial transparency requirements, and democratic decision-making processes that would prevent any future board member from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Marcus had wielded for so many years. Property values began recovering as the oppressive atmosphere lifted and families no longer feared arbitrary harassment for minor aesthetic disagreements. And several new residents moved into the neighborhood, specifically because they had heard about the community's successful resistance to HOA tyranny. The toll booth, meanwhile, continued operating profitably as a daily reminder of how Marcus's attempt to bully me into submission had backfired spectacularly and resulted in permanent consequences for his abuse of power, with residents paying their $5 fees while sharing stories about the neighborhood's liberation from his authoritarian rule. The final irony was that Marcus's obsession with property values and community standards had ultimately been achieved through his removal rather than his enforcement efforts, as the neighborhood became a more desirable place to live once residents were free from the fear and harassment that had characterized his 8-year reign of terror. 2 years after Marcus Thompson's imprisonment and the collapse of his HOA empire, I sit in my home office each morning reviewing the previous day's toll receipts while my grandfather's restored John Deere tractor sits proudly in the driveway, no longer the subject of violation notices, but rather a beloved neighborhood landmark that visitors often ask about during their walks through our peaceful community. The toll booth operation has been remarkably successful, generating consistent monthly revenue that has more than compensated for the legal costs of acquiring the road and defending against Marcus's frivolous lawsuits, while also serving as a permanent reminder to future HOA board members about the importance of treating residents with respect rather than contempt. The neighborhood has transformed into the kind of genuine community that Marcus claimed to want but never actually achieved through his authoritarian tactics, with residents cooperating voluntarily on maintenance projects, social events, and conflict resolution without the fear and harassment that characterized his reign of terror. Our new HOA board operates with complete transparency, rotating leadership positions, and democratic decision-making processes that ensure no single individual can accumulate the kind of unchecked power that Marcus abused for so many years, and violation enforcement is now based on reasonable standards applied consistently rather than personal vendettas and selective harassment. Property values have recovered and exceeded their previous peaks, as families are attracted to a neighborhood known for successfully resisting HOA tyranny and establishing a model of residential governance based on mutual respect rather than authoritarian control. The toll road has become something of a local legend, with real estate agents using it as a selling point when marketing homes in our area, explaining to potential buyers that they would be living in a community where residents successfully stood up to abusive authority and created lasting consequences for those who tried to exploit their neighbors. Marcus himself was released from jail after serving 14 months of his sentence, but his life bears no resemblance to the comfortable suburban existence he enjoyed during his years of neighborhood domination, as he now lives in a small apartment across town, works at a grocery store, and makes monthly restitution payments that will continue for at least another decade. His attempts to rebuild his reputation and social standing have been unsuccessful, as his criminal conviction and notorious history make him unwelcome in most residential communities, and his name has become synonymous with HOA abuse in local real estate and legal circles. The broader impact of our neighborhood's resistance has inspired residents in other communities to challenge their own abusive HOA boards, with several successful recall elections and legal actions directly attributed to the precedent we established by fighting back against Marcus's tyranny rather than accepting it as inevitable. Local attorneys now refer potential clients to our case as an example of how thorough documentation, legal knowledge, and strategic thinking can overcome seemingly insurmountable power imbalances in residential community disputes. My law practice has benefited significantly from the publicity surrounding the case, as homeowners throughout the region seek representation for their own HOA disputes. And I have become something of a specialist in helping residents fight back against abusive association boards and discriminatory enforcement practices. The restored tractor that started this entire conflict remains in my driveway as a symbol of the importance of standing up to bullies, preserving family heritage, and refusing to be intimidated by those who mistake temporary authority for permanent power. Every morning when I see that beautiful 1952 John Deere gleaming in the sunlight, I remember my grandfather's lessons about hard work, integrity, and the importance of fighting for what's right. And I smile knowing that Marcus's attempt to force me to get rid of my most treasured possession instead resulted in his own complete destruction and the liberation of our entire neighborhood from his oppressive rule.
Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of neighborly conflict, the abuse of authority, and the strategic triumph over injustice. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and the dramatic consequences of underestimating a determined individual.